So, Leigh is going to talk to us a bit about some different thoughts to do with how we deliver cloud online education.
Yep, I'll try and get it down to 5 minutes or 3 minutes over the discussion.
There you go.
So the very premise I approach is that there is not an example yet from universities successfully developing online learning. In my 12 years of experience with 7 institutions, from the lens that I put onto it, or the criteria that I put onto it at least, there isn't an example of success. And to try and illustrate that is to try and compare to where online learning is very evidently successful, and that's in informal learning. So if we were to think about the university in terms of the left column, publishing industry, the television sector industry, the cinema, the films, festivals and theatre, news and journalism, obviously they're all operating on an old paradigm of practice with older methods of development and measures of success, and all of them struggle to relate to a new world that people talk about that has been enabled from the internet. On the right is keywords that illustrate that new world. The internet is largely developed, or the web, I should say, is largely developed from hacker culture. That's not the hacker that is being used by news media in the left column. You struggle to understand the right column. Hacker culture is a very different thing to malicious software and all of that sort of stereotyping. The internet and software generally comes from free software, and otherwise some people call that open source software. Open and crowdsource finance, content like Wikipedia and software and things like that is an operating principle, and partly the reason why the likes of Microsoft are hated so vehemently by other programmers is because of the belief, at least, that Microsoft stole from the open source community and closed down their work. Yes, with gritted teeth, we have to bear it. Networked gift economies is another theory. Leigh Blackall writes about the wealth of networks, and he looks outward. So he works in a university, but he doesn't even reference to the university as an example of explaining that. He looks out into the internet. Radical transparency comes from this, is from initiatives like Government 2.0, which was an attempt to get government data into the open internet, Creative Commons licensing of government-generated content, etc. But further, to make more transparent the processes in which agencies work and their decision paths and things like that. Connected to that is open data. Peer-to-peer file sharing, otherwise people might know that as Pirate Bay or BitTorrent file sharing, is an example of a very obvious sector that's thriving and flourishing, despite what the left column would do through law and other sort of overt and contrived methods to try and control that emerging economy. Folksonomy is a word as opposed to taxonomy. Taxonomy is something the libraries like to think about. Folksonomy is quite different to that, linked to folklore and folk music and things like that. I use a word that tries to encompass all of those, called webism, as in socialism, as in feminism, as in Marxism. It's a belief system or a group of ideologies that is inspired by the internet, and the universities have played no part in any of this. So the next slide. The foundation of this webism comes from postmodernism, to level it up a bit to some sort of scholarly level. These are the authors that I would cite who inspired this, who wrote before there was such a thing as an internet, but arguably and observably inspired many of the ethics and ideologies that drive the internet as a technology. The BBC documentarian Adam Curtis makes good documentaries to try and uncover the underlying ideologies that become the technology, not just the programming technology, but the very institutions and processes we use. And the most recent one he made is called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And it's quite a good documentary to look at the interesting foundations, ideological foundations that made what the internet, mixed with the military investment of the internet, so the web and the internet, and the thing that's produced as a result of that combination. On the right, I've just cited New School in Society, which for me is fundamentally the internet in terms of informal learning webs and the easily measurable success of online learning as opposed to the failures. So the next slide. So we in universities struggle to relate those polarized experiences. There's what we do in the university based on a paradigm and a premise that not many of us question. There's what we could, if we looked, can observe going on outside of our remit, but so few of us have any way to look and observe. Naturally, in my line of work, I read research that's published to do with education. Almost all of it is introverted. It looks at groups of people we class as students, enrolled in an experience that we call a course, and measuring outcomes based on activities we describe as assessment. And almost none of them look at how to measure informal learning as it takes place outside. So that, from what I can observe of research, that creates a big blind spot, because our practice then is to do literature reviews and to benchmark in risk-averse culture. We never expose ourselves to these outside ideas. We don't have a mechanism for doing it. So I kind of come to the conclusion that our basic premise of how learning happens is in an old paradigm, and that premise prevents us from realizing how it really happens now. So the next slide, I think it's almost the finals. These are by no means the best examples. Free University International closed in 1981, but was started in '76 by artist Joseph Beuys, German artist, fantastic artist. And he was representing those early ideologies and ideas and methods of Foucault and Illich of trying to free the university ideal, unlocking it from its kind of institutional dogma. Melbourne Free University, right here in Melbourne, and partly the reason I moved to Melbourne, exists, and we don't have any relationship or understanding of how that works. Networked learning is an idea. There's a Wikipedia article around that, which I've largely been the author of that, and it's an attempt to try and look at examples of people writing about this phenomenon of folk informal learning. And some of the earliest writing I've found is when we installed telegraph lines in the 1860s. And other things about when railways were built and things like that. Some interesting ideas and examples of when we were able to look outside. Student as Producer is an interesting example of University of Lincoln did a 3-year project on the basis of students as producers of content, and we'll look at some examples in a real short second. Open academic practice is also another catchphrase, and we talked about that at the scholarly teaching and learning session earlier this week, was it, or last week? Last week. Final slides. So examples of a more lateral arrangement where institutions, not just universities, are able to observe what happens outside and then to align their practices to be complementary to those. These aren't by any means excellent examples, they're just examples of the beginnings of that lateral thinking and the boundaries permeating and breaking down a little bit. So Wiki Project Med, from what I understood, but I'm just reading on the page now, I thought it was a Canadian-initiated project, and I still think it is, but it's since morphed into a non-profit organisation based in New York, and their mission to make clear, reliable, comprehensive, up-to-date educational resources and information in the biomedical and related social sciences freely available to all people in the language of their choice using the Wikipedia project. I'm not aware of any university that's endeavoured to engage in such mission. So but this is a network of non-university organisations, but I'm pretty sure it was sparked by a Canadian emergency doctor. We call those people in emergency wards. Yeah, he started it, and it just grew and grew and grew until it became an example of institutions engaging with Wikipedia rather than banning it or obfuscating it, and doing their best to lift the standard of medical coverage on not just English. Quickly, the next, I've personally been involved in the history of the Paralympics Australia project. Their initial call for expression of interest was to help them write the history of the Paralympics. At the University of Canberra, we saw what was going on in Wiki Project Med and many other examples, so we suggested that they write it in Wikipedia. That was something they weren't expecting. Because we made the proposal open source, in other words, the first sentence of our proposal was on a website, they were compelled to watch the proposal develop. And in that process, it was a very interesting process because while the rest of the tenderers, Queensland University of Technology, for example, were writing their applications up to the due date and then sending it, we were writing our application months before and was on the web and developing and inviting contribution. So naturally, we got the tender. That wasn't what we set out to do, but it was an interesting dynamic created by openly developing the proposal. So as a result of that, the International Paralympics Organisation has now changed the way they manage their press releases and their coverage and stuff, making sure that it's licensed so that they can go up on Wikipedia. Next slide. All these examples are wikis, I'm sorry, but yeah, they're just some of the better ones, I guess, that I know of.
Well, we have been asked just in the last month to work on a database of environmental art projects, which we will put into this format.
Yeah, interestingly, there's another. I think the wikis, it's not because of the technology, it's not really to do with wikis, it's because it's really the only domain where those earlier ideologies of the internet, that webism stuff, have been allowed to exist and flourish. An enclosure around those ideologies, commercialization and corporate interest and stuff has happened everywhere else on the internet, but in a project like the Wikimedia and projects in the Commons, it has basically resisted. There is no advertising or no commercial interest in any of this space. Not that that's an enemy to it all, it just has helped to prevent any of that enclosure or on the ideologies. This is a student-authored open textbook, a very interesting story. A teacher, as it commonly is given a subject that they know nothing about to teach. There was a textbook that they would rely on, a bit like the models we just saw before. But in this instance, a past student made a very formal complaint about the textbook and successfully got it removed from the course, leaving the course with no textbook. So the teacher contacted me. I was working in that faculty, and I said, well, how about students, you just change the essays to not being essays but be chapters in the would-be textbook. It's a psychology course, by the way. And as a result of that, 3 years it took to get, like the first iteration, there was a massive amount of content, but naturally only some of it was to a standard of a textbook. But after 3 years, the quantity of that standard naturally increases, and now they have an open source textbook that can be freely used. The old textbook used to cost $160. This costs nothing and can be printed and bound for $12. So the next, University of Wollongong, journalism students write into the Wikinews project, and the teacher marking workload has gone through the floor because he has managed to establish a relation with the volunteers on Wikinews. Wikinews is quite a robust journalism publishing site. As he's forged a relationship with that community to say, if my students get onto the front page, in other words, pass your peer review, they pass my course.
Authentic assessment.
Yes. At first it was a problem, and still is to a degree, because they overwhelmed the volunteers, too many students. And unfortunately, going back to my criticism of the university, the wider faculty don't recognise the innovation or uniqueness of this, and have prevented the teacher coming through with their promise of getting postgraduates to be reviewers, editorial reviewers, and assist the volunteers. So it looks like that project is endangered. I think that's the last one. My own personal attempt, as unqualified as I am, to do one of the only that I'm aware of research projects to look at how informal learning takes place out on the internet, compare it to how it takes place inside institutions, and to measure it. terms of learning outcomes. That's it, I think. So yeah, the only reason I put that in there is, in my opinion, it's not to be polarising. It's a genuine hope that we can find a way to bring a viewpoint which is actually a pre-compromise viewpoint. I have a more extreme view over here. This is the compromise version, and to try and find a way to create space where we can actually be unique and innovative in this space on the naive belief that these institutions are open to that. That's all from me.